So the London Marathon, who do we fancy in this year's race? What about the world's second fastest ever male marathon runner? He's running. Or what about Charlotte Purdue, the fourth fastest ever British female marathon runner at 2:23:26? She's also running. We've also got last year's winners coming back, both in the women here and also in the men. What about these two YouTubers, both about 35 years of age, both prolific marathon runners, both hoping to do PBs. We've got Amrit Guittara here. And we've also got Andy Raynor, the Forest of Dean runner. So like I did for Nick Bester and Matt Fox for the Berlin Marathon, I thought I'd look at their training and see what we can see about their prospects for the race on Sunday. Okay, so of course we need a spreadsheet to look into all this stuff. So I've got Andy here, the Forest of Dean runner, and Amrit here, or Amrit Powell, I think is his official name, a bit like Tim and Timothy for me, I guess. So here's a summary of what they did for their training. So like I did for Nick Bester and Matt Fox for Rotterdam and more recently Berlin, I've looked at the 13 weeks prior to the taper week, so effectively 14 weeks back from the start, but excluding the last taper week because it sort of felt like it skewed all the stats and stuff. So the block miles here is the number of miles that they covered in that 13 weeks apart from that final taper week. So basically between 27th of June and 25th of September with the race date on Sunday the 2nd of October. So you can see here that Andy did 858 miles in that period, Amrit did 764, and you contrast that with the 220 guys, or almost. Unfortunately, Nick was just 8 seconds out, and they did somewhat more. So yeah, that's kind of understandable, isn't it? You've got a higher target, and his target is to get under 239, and Amrit's is sub 250, he tells me. So you can see here that if you plotted a graph of expectation against miles run, then instantly you'd say, well, the faster guys are actually running more miles, which is interesting in itself. So that works out an average weekly mileage for Andy of 66, 59, but Nick and Matt were well into the 80s. I've also included the number of miles that they've done so far in 2022 to see what their average training paces were. And again, it tells a similar story. One thing you do notice straight away, that Andy's average training pace is very little different to the guys who are running much faster. But we'll delve into that in a bit more detail. Amrit's is a bit slower, as you might expect from somebody running or hoping to run 250. I think his PB is actually 251 and Andy's is 244. So let's dive a bit more into the weekly mileage, and both of them had really good training blocks, I thought, actually. I think Amrit had COVID early in July, so that accounts for that very down week there. And I think he was coming off an injury, so he missed all the spring marathons. So I guess he was coming into it not that fit. But from here onwards, he had a good solid block and didn't really miss any training. And Andy also had a very good training block. And I think his only down weeks there were in the weeks that he were actually doing races. And Andy was running, I'd say, 5 days a week, but he was doing these double threshold days. So effectively, he's cramming in 6 days training into 5 days. And Amrit was running basically, as far as I could see, 6 days a week with usually about one rest day. So his average there of 59 was slightly skewed by the fact he had 1 week or only 8 miles. So all in all, you would say that the mileages are pretty similar. Just Andy was just only marginally ahead. If we look at the longest run that each of these did, it's quite similar to what Nick and Matt did, who both did long runs around the 24-mile mark. Again, neither actually got up to the full distance in training. Andy there had a highest mileage of 24 miles and Amrit was 22. Their actual approaches, though, were quite different. Andy's long runs would generally run at sort of aerobic threshold pace, so for him it was around about 6:30s, where Amrit did a lot more sort of marathon pace work during his long runs. He didn't do too many runs where he just ran straight out, as it were. What I've also done is broken down their miles into 3 sort of quality type miles. We've got aerobic threshold miles here. We've got marathon pace miles and harder miles. Now, obviously, marathon pace miles is fairly obvious, which for Andy, targeting sub 239 is pretty much a 6-minute mile pace. And for Amrit, targeting sub 250, it's pretty much the 6:30 pace. So, you know, nice round sums. And also I've defined this aerobic threshold, similar to what I did for Nick and Matt. For those guys targeting 5:20 as their sub 220 pace, I use 6 minutes. So I've added about 40 to 45 seconds. So for Andy, I've called it a notional 6:45, and for Amrit 7:15. Now it's interesting that Andy does a lot of his long runs pretty much at that aerobic threshold mark. So it's interesting here to see what their actual percentages come out. And you see here that Andy does an incredible amount of aerobic threshold miles. 299 out of his 858 were in this aerobic threshold miles, largely because I think that was all of his sort of long runs and some of his other sessions as well. And he's also quite into sort of quality. Because he only runs 5 days a week with his double threshold day typically. He's also running quite a lot of marathon pace miles and harder miles there. 116 marathon pace miles and 121 harder miles. Now, Amrit's approach is somewhat different. He tends to emphasize more sort of quality. He does quite a lot of sessions where he was basically running quite fast, I thought, and his actual marathon pace, he was actually doing a lot of his marathon pace runs more like about 6:20 pace as opposed to his target of 6:30. He did actually tell me he did that deliberately, so it'd be interesting to see on the day whether that pays off or not. So a lot of these marathon pace miles here for Amrit were actually probably more like about 6:20, so it was actually quite difficult to sometimes to distinguish between what was a marathon pace mile and a harder mile. Didn't do so much running at the aerobic threshold mark, and as I said, a lot of his long runs on a Sunday were sort of like mixed sessions. He was doing marathon pace blocks within a long run, so his 22-mile run there wasn't a straight through run. So if you go back to the summary again, we can see that the long runs here for all the 4 marathon runners here, their long runs are all pretty much the same, aren't they? All around 24. Amrit just slightly less. And what I thought was very interesting is, as well as the average pace here, the 80-20 ratio. So they sort of say you should be running for every sort of 5 runs you do, 4 would be sort of easier, 1 harder. Well, Andy kind of bucks that trend. He's actually got only 38% of his runs are kind of easy. So obviously 62% of his runs are basically harder. So basically pretty much 2/3 of all his runs are quite hard. And I think that because he breaks down his week into a long run, which is kind of at steady pace. So I did classify that within the aerobic threshold marker there, that 299 massive thing. So that does rather contribute to this huge total of harder miles, 536. So it'd be very interesting to see whether that really sort of tough training program pays dividends for him. Because I guess it's offset by the fact he actually has 2 rest days a week. So he's actually cramming in quite huge mileage into 5 days. So if you actually look at that, it's actually averaging a half marathon a day for all the days he's actually running. So that's quite demanding work. I mean, if you look at that compared to Nick and Matt, who don't really tend to have too many rest days, he's actually running more on the days he runs than these 220 aspirants, as it were. But obviously the overall volume is a bit lower because he has those 2 rest days. Amrit, I would say, is a bit more conventional with his mileage. He's running basically just around about 60 with basically 1 day off. So it's still quite a heavy program. And I also was struck by the fact that he was doing quite a lot of quality as well. So his 80-20 ratio, again, is sort of definitely on the harder side, 66%. And interestingly, that both of these guys targeting a slightly slower time are actually basically training a lot harder pro rata to the sub 220 guys. I think it's just basically because they're just doing less overall volume. So maybe there's the thinking that they need to cram more sort of tougher sessions into it. I think it's an interesting theory, and what do you think about that? I mean, it's quantity over quality, but I think it's quite evident that the better running you get when we get into the true elite markers here, past the 220s and probably past 230, 235 for the women, it's very rare to see anybody as a marathon runner not allegedly doing at least 100 miles a week. So it's interesting how the approaches of the people who aren't perhaps at that level are slightly different to what you might actually read in the textbooks. But then they do take a lot from the likes of Canova. A lot of Andy's sessions are sort of taken from Canova's styling, but perhaps they overlook all the sort of the easier side of it, just trying to cram everything in. So yeah, I mean, you can't really argue because Andy's been doing PBs. In fact, if you look at their races, Andy did a 10k PB in the back end of July. Amrit did some solid races as well. Maybe not quite his PB level, but I think he was coming off a bit of an injury, as I said, in the spring, and then COVID. So I'm surprised he's not quite in the shape he was. Hopefully he's sort of peaking towards the marathon on Sunday. So what do you think about these two guys and how they compare to the faster runners? It's interesting to see how their approaches are actually slightly different when you actually look at it in more detail. Anyway, good luck to all the runners, especially Andy and Amrit, and I'll be looking forward to, with great interest, to see how they get on. So I hope you enjoyed this little look at the London Marathon training of the YouTubers. If you've got any more ideas for people you'd like me to look at again, then please let me know. So once again, I hope you found this interesting. Like and subscribe on that, and see you in the next one then. Bye.